just out of respect of everyone who did join us on time, I'm gonna kick off. So welcome everybody. My name's John Hitchin. I'm Chief Executive of Natsayi. I'm really glad that so many of you are joining us today to talk about place-based system change. I'm just a little bit of housekeeping. We will be recording this and sharing it afterwards. So you know, I hope that's okay for everybody. If you've got a significant problem with that, please let me know. I'd be grateful, as I said earlier, that you mute yourselves. And if you have questions, hopefully there will be lots of questions coming through, that you use the chat function. So please do feel free to throw things in the chat as the presentations are going on. And basically what we're going to have is myself talking for a little bit to introduce the framework, and then a couple of colleagues are going to, who I will introduce properly in a moment, we'll talk, and then we'll have time for questions from all of you, and then a little bit on next steps. And we plan to close at 2 o'clock. So I think we've got enough coming in, so I'm going to start sharing my screen now, I think. He says. Right, so welcome one and all. For those of you who don't know us, Natsayi is a social enterprise. We've been going for 20 years, well, 22 years now. And place is the thread really that runs through what we do. We do a variety of things, some frontline delivery work of ourselves, lots of work with organizations, and also we have a long history of working directly in places, often in quite collaborative ways, and with partnerships on different programs over the last 20 years. I won't read through all of these slides because that's tedious, but you know, that's who we are if you don't know us, and please find out more if you're interested. So today, though, more importantly, we've got hopefully a kind of something that will be, you know, I'm really excited actually by the level of interest in this, both from people coming, but also other organizations and individuals who've approached us, talking about the framework that we produced in partnership with Save the Children UK and a number of other organizations over the last year, really. And to present that framework and to talk a little bit with colleagues, Natsayi from Save and Skeet from Volunteering Matters, who will give a fuller introduction themselves to talk a little bit about the context of that work, but also an example of a place who are doing this and were part of our research. So what we're going to do is I'll talk a little bit about the research and the framework, then hand over to Natsayi to talk about kind of Save's reason for supporting this and some of their thinking in the context, and then Stephen will tell us a little bit about his reflections on the framework, but also hopefully you know, a really kind of interesting way into this by talking a little bit about what they're actually doing in a place that sort of fits with this framework. So without further ado, so what was the problem? These, you know, pieces of work and discussions often start with a problem, and it was a problem that I suppose started with a number of conversations amongst a range of individuals from quite a broad set of organizations who were initially pulled together by colleagues at Save. And it was just kind of talking about programs that were interested in long-term place-based approaches with certain values and methods to them. And as those conversations, they were facilitated by Paul Perkins, who's now moved on to Redbridge Council but did stay involved in this work. As Paul kind of kicked those off, I think more and more people in that grouping got interested in a challenge of what does get supported in the social sector and why. And why do those of us who felt like there's something really powerful about place-based long-term systemic approaches, why do we feel like they don't get that much resource, or it can be very challenging to get resource into those sorts of approaches? And I suppose in a way that was the kind of starting point. the problem with this, the title of it, place-based systemic change, is they're quite jargony concepts. Our sector is full of them, and often the challenge is to try and unpick what people mean by them. At Renati, we talk about place a lot, but we're acutely aware that when you talk about place-based working, often people can mean very, very different things from that. We tend to split it up into 5 different meanings. Some talk more about kind of regeneration, as in big capital investments in places. Some talk it in a devolution and local government perspective. Some it's more about community-led work being the driver. But in this instance, what I was really excited about in these conversations was using place as the boundary for a system. There's lots of different ways to put boundaries around systems, but using place as the boundary for system and thinking about the relationship between place and changing systems, changing local systems. So that was the sort of way in. At this point, I just want to flag a massive thanks to the people who supported this project throughout the 12 months. So I've already mentioned Natsayi Sithole, who's at Save the Children UK, and she'll be talking in a second, but Paul Perkins helped set it up. And then I've had an enormous amount of support whilst I've been doing this from Laura Fairness at National Lotteries Communities Fund, Louisa Mitchell at West London Zone, Gemma Drake at the Children's Society, Ollie Hilbury at Making Every Adult Matter Coalition, and also Nicola Pritchard, particularly in the early months from MPC. And I wanted to flag that now because we're going to be talking a lot about collaboration in this framework, and it was a real collaborative effort to think about these challenges and thinking about this work. So our question was, what might it take to shift more resource to this sort of work? Well, we went about it by kind of 3 relatively simple methods, to be honest, but they weren't simple in their execution. One was starting to kind of read about and think about the literature, but it is an incredibly wide literature. Many of you will have read lots of things about place-based working, about system change in the social sector. There are lots of organisations, lots of funders, both within the UK and internationally, who think about this, who try and apply it, and you could spend months of your life exploring that literature. So we tried to think practically about what we wanted to focus on, what might be the sorts of tools that might start to shift the behaviour to get more funding into these kinds of approaches. And so we kind of tried to focus on that. And in doing so, then when we started talking to funders, it became much easier to think about who we wanted to talk to. So we spoke to funders of all different sizes and types. So family foundations, large, very well-known national independent foundations, some smaller local foundations that are place-based themselves, community foundations, and as well as the sort of different types of funders, we also looked at funders in ways that had different types of attitudes towards these sorts of concepts. So there were some funders who were kind of fully invested in the concepts of place-based working or system change, some who were a bit more agnostic about it, who thought maybe this could be useful for what we fund, maybe we might want to apply these terms to what we do, and some who were a bit more skeptical of these terms and felt that they might be a distraction to getting money into communities and practice. So we were able to speak to a very broad range of funders, and I'll talk a little bit about what came out of that in a second. But then when we wanted to talk to and visit and understand places, it became even almost impossible to sample, because what really did we mean by our definition of place-based systemic change? What did we want to see when we were looking at it? In some ways, you could rule almost everything out, but in other ways, you could kind of include significant chunks of all social sector activity. And it became an interesting challenge. So what was important then was the definition of what we were talking about. And this definition didn't resolve that challenge of who to sample, but it did give us some boundaries to think about as we started to talk to places and talk to organisations before we'd start to do our case studies. And this is the definition that the work finished with. So for those of you who've seen it, there are 5 papers, one an intro, one a write-up of our experiences and insights from working with funders, one is the case studies of places that we went to visit, which actually we've published as separate pages on a site. So it's not really a paper by itself, it's rather the case studies. Then there's the framework itself, which I'll be talking to in a second, and then the next steps. And throughout those papers, this definition subtly evolved, but the fundamentals of it were a focus, and by focus, it had to not be limited to a single organization or service, a time horizon that was long-term in ambition and practice, an approach that was heavily relational between people and organizations, a scale that was understood by those who'd lived in those places and relevant to the systemic challenge, which meant that it could well be neighborhood working, but it could also be local authority in scale. And we found some different examples and different practices that included both of those. And finally, it had to have an intentionality to it. It had to have, even if you were relatively early stage in your work, you had to be sort of thinking that structural change was where you wanted to get to, and shifting systems was what you believed was important about your practice, rather than the delivery of high quality programs, for example, which is a perfectly valid and important objective, but that intentionality became important. Now that's not, those 5 things when you add them up doesn't give you a neat binary definition where you could put every kind of, you could look at any project or any organization and say, okay, that is definitely doing place-based system change and that is not. But it gave us enough to start to talk to organizations. And I was very fortunate to talk to an incredible range of impressive organizations about their work, much of it quite inspirational. I would, if you do nothing else after this webinar, I would encourage that you look at the case studies on our site, which we'll provide links to if you haven't already, to just start to learn a little bit more about those organizations. But in the interest of time, what I want to do with my time now today is to kind of jump to the framework itself. So after speaking to all those funders, reading some of the literature, thinking hard about how we might shift more resource to these sorts of approaches, thinking about the definitions, what we came up with was this framework. Now, in the document that's on our website, and if you are interested, I'd really encourage you to look at the sort of the quite wordy tables in that framework, because it's helpful to sort of describe some of the movements and concepts that I'm going to talk about here. But this is the visual of it. And one of the things that I was struck by as I went to visit different places and talked in detail with people about what they were trying to achieve and what the experience of trying to work over many years in a place and trying to shift sometimes quite small, sometimes quite large systemic challenges, was that 3 of those places, and one of them is Stephen, and in the work in Ipswich that used this language, talked about 5 different stages of their work. And so I, after hearing this 3 times, the 5 kind of stuck in my head. And they all use different words to describe it. And so these are very much my words. And if they don't work for you, that's my fault, not any of the places. But what I was struck by was a sort of a flow of these 5 different stages to the work. So the more I thought about it, the more it became clear that whilst many of these places and organizations were hugely different, a national charity versus a sort of social enterprise style building that was thinking about its relationship to the wider place, to something that was about a local charity that evolved its practice. These are hugely different organizations, hugely different business models, hugely different typical routes to funding, but they were talking a similar sort of language. So what we tried to do with this really was to think about systemic being the kind of, in this diagram, the thing that we're aiming for, but there being very different ways in, and your approach, and kind of so much of the social sector prioritizes the approach, if you like, and the outcome. So what kind of organization are you and what are you trying to achieve? And what we tried to do here was to sort of acknowledge that there are different approaches and they will have different organizational objectives. But there's something through the process of, if they are working towards these systemic place-based ambitions, that they actually start to share more than you would think from an initial view at of kind of looking at the organizations from the outside. And so these levels, which is the sort of second, if the approaches are the first key element of this framework, the levels, the upside down rainbow is the second key element. And then the third key element became, and just to say on those levels, the experience of moving through them will be different for different organizational types, but they still share some similarities. So obviously level 2 feels, the established level will feel different if you're a large national charity to if you're a small social enterprise setting up something in your place. But the qualities of what they're trying to work on is quite similar. But what the third element to this framework, which I want to talk about, is the step changes. And they were where we tried to talk to places and really understand and unpick what the big challenges for them developing their practice and getting more systemic had been, either for where they were today, or maybe if they'd been working on this for multiple years, some of the things that they'd worked through. And what were those challenges, and how could we kind of think about what was common to them? And what became apparent to me, I suppose, as I started to look back at all of the data and pull it all together, was it was the movement between the stages that I've described, the levels, that were the hardest things to do. And I'm going to talk about those in a second. So for the approaches, you kind of think, is one way to think about these different approaches is, is this about who's doing it, which organization is doing it, or is it a little bit more about where they've started? And I think it's perhaps a little bit more about where their starting point is, even though they're all aiming towards systemic work. And I think the things to just really acknowledge and slightly repeating my here is that there's different starting points mean that these organizations have different assets, different strengths, and different business models. When you move to the levels, one way of thinking about it is, this is just a function of time. So the more time that you spend in a place, the more likely you are to move up these levels. And I don't think that is the case. I think, yes, time matters. You do need to, you can't just walk into a place and be doing long-term place-wide inclusive social change in systemic ways, like on day one. So there is a time element to this, but the time, it's not solely a function of time. These levels are also a function of commitment and of that intentionality that I talked about earlier in our definition. And that means some pretty hard choices at times. And I know Stephen's going to talk about some of those challenges in a minute. And then finally, so the step changes that I talked about, these are the hardest points. And I think that what we started to think about as I then started to bring together the experiences of places to the challenges of funders was, how can philanthropic money potentially help with these movements and step changes? And these became some of the more interesting questions to think about what's next and how to get different kind of resource into it. So for example, moving from connection to mutuality, where you might have, working in partnership with a number of organizations and feeling like you've kind of layered a number of things into your practice and you're feeling quite confident about what you're doing. How do you move to mutuality, which is much more kind of collaborative working? Or the big challenge there is how you kind of let go and accept that you need to work with others in a very kind of open way, rather than just kind of keep building on your own business model and strengthening it. And that's the sort of thing that sounds really easy to do. You can kind of say that in a seminar and it sounds, yes, we should all be doing that in the social sector. But the realities of business models and the kind of the nature of a lot of organizations can make that very, very challenging. And so often organizations need support, and many of the organizations that I spoke to talked about, struggling to pay staff in those in the time when they were shifting from those stages, or having to hand back money that just didn't meet their values, or doing quite big, bold things, and that was really, really hard, and they would have benefited hugely by having somebody stand next to them and say, we're going to support you through this because we can see where you're going. And that seeing where you're going, I suppose, is one of the things that when we finish this framework and start to think about, okay, well, what could it be useful for? Could it help? What could we do with it? Does it meet the initial objectives of our research? Was one of the uses we think, and I've had some feedback that this might be the case, is it can help places tell stories about their past, present, and future. So it can help kind of situate, okay, well, this is where we've been and this is where we're trying to go to. And it can give us a sort of a narrative frame and a language to talk about the kind of work that we do want to be doing. And it can help organizations hopefully think about their values and why they started out with those intentions that they did. And even though it's hard, here's a framework to talk to others about what you're trying to do, and here's a framework to kind of identify your own practice and work. Hopefully it can also help funders think a little bit about what kind of precise partnership relationships they can have with places. From a lot of the work that we at Renacey do with a very broad range of trusts and foundations and other funders, many of them are really keen to get the right kind of relationships with places, not wanting to be too much, they don't want to be seen as being in the lead. They really want to be supportive. There's a whole range of kind of things that funders want to get right. And I think what we hope is that thinking a little bit more in detail about these step changes could be a way to build, stronger, more mutually supportive partnerships. And also something that I wonder about is, can it help build confidence for places and for funders in funding and working in ways that don't fit the kind of mental model that I think we all fall into a little bit at times in the social sector, which is we need to pilot something, build an evidence base for it, replicate it, and then scale it. And even though we kind of know that approach alone isn't the sole right, often there's lots of brilliant organizations that have taken that approach and have done some amazing work with it. But even though we all kind of know that that's not the only way to do social change, sometimes the mental models that we have within organizations or that funders have can mean that the languages and the tools that we use internally sort of push us towards thinking that that's the way we've always got to work. And I think I'm hopeful that this framework and other, there's a lot of work out there at the moment from a range of organizations that really fits with the values of this work, I think, can be supportive of thinking about other good quality ways of thinking and different mental models that can kind of encourage different kinds of approaches to social change. And so just to kind of to finish my my intro, really, we're keen to build on this. This is for us at Renacey and in talking to a range of partners, many of who I kind of name checked earlier, but also others that have approached us since. I'm proud of the work that we've done here, but I also know that it is just a starting point. It alone isn't sufficient to shift resourcing or funding or some of the kind of ambitions that we had for this. I think there's lots of detail that needs fleshing out underneath our kind of the headlines of our framework. If you do have a look at the document, there is more detail in there than I've skipped through today, quite a bit more, but at the same time, it still feels like there's much more work to be done to really understanding what that actually means and looks like in places, and where the significant challenges are and where the kind of key areas of learning could be. And so because of that, one of the things that we're starting in a couple of weeks' time is a sort of first session of an early, we're not trying to be too formal or grandiose about this yet, but just kind of talking about the idea of a community of practice for places and communities to start to engage with this framework and to see whether there's interest in that, see whether we can sort of kick around the framework, see where places sit on it, see whether it's useful to them, start to share learning between each other, and start to kind of build a bit more crunchy information underneath some of the, the kind of broad headings of this that could help with learning, could help with practice improvement, could do all the things that you kind of hope that a community of practice would do. So we're keen to build on this framework by kicking that off, and I kind of want to be led by the interest of others on that front. We're having a couple of different conversations with different funders at the moment about their interest in this work, and one of the things that we did put in the kind of the fourth paper was a sort of a little tool that funders could sort of start to use to think about where their money is going currently and where their practice is currently focusing, and we would be keen to kind of talk to other funders about that and see whether this is in any way useful to them. And just from a Renacey perspective, we're a social enterprise. We trade to try and kind of develop new ideas and new ways of working, and we're putting our own resource into developing our own place-based system change practice ourselves in two of the boroughs that we know best, and I put that in Hackney and Southwark in London, and I put that there because, you know, we don't see, you know, the strength, I hope, of Renacy is that we both do frontline delivery and work in communities and in places, and we also think about it, and we don't just see ourselves as part of the kind of post-it note brigade, but trying to think about a kind of skin in the game for these sorts of ideas. And so we're looking to kind of implement this in our own practice as well and think about its value there. So I have gone through that relatively quickly, but I hope in a way that is gives you a bit of information to sort of whet your appetite, clarify some of maybe thoughts of those of you who have looked at things already, and I would encourage you to sort of have a look at the documents. Before I hand over, I just want to repeat my massive thanks to those colleagues from different organisations who supported this work over the last 12 months on the steering group for it. It really was hugely valuable to have such expertise, but particularly want to give thanks to Natsayi Sithole, who sort of brought her expertise and patience and knowledge from SAVE to support us to deliver this. And so without further ado, I will hand over to Natsayi to tell you a little bit about why they've supported this and what they think of it.
Hi everyone, thanks John. And as we will be saying quite a lot of thank yous today, because there were so many people involved with this work, and that's what made it really useful in my view, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But big thanks to John, who was extraordinarily patient with all of us through this entire process and carried quite a lot of this himself. But welcome everyone, and I'm really happy to see so many people here today. So it's a good question to ask. Why on earth would an organisation like Save the Children commission this kind of work and this inquiry? So it's a really good kind of starting question for us. So I hope to clarify that a little bit. So to be specific, the work that I lead on and the work that Paul Perkins also led on when he was working with us at Save the Children and initiated this inquiry is specifically focused on our work nationally in the UK. So as you know, Save the Children is an international organisation, but it also has a domestic programming arm, which is based in the UK. And the size of that operation is about the size of a medium-sized national charity. And that's the piece that I lead and run at the moment in terms of strategy and business development. So we mobilise quite a lot of resource into places year to year, about £8 to £11 million. It's quite a sizable amount of money. And for us, we were butting up against, which I'll explain a little bit later, the challenge of generating the right kind of funding and the right kind of relationships to enable us to make a kind of strategic shift in how we were working. So we knew at the time there are loads of different contributors as to why places in particular kind of fail to effectively support local people. And one of those issues, the biggest issues we found anyway, was how those places are supported and funded. We know that sources of funding, approaches to awarding and managing funding, and the behaviours and the requirements of funders and funding mechanisms, including fundraisers like our own. We are a big fundraising machine, as you guys know, rarely engage with complexity and support long-term systemic change or that kind of work to happen and be initiated. We wanted to explore kind of how this could be improved, both for ourselves, but primarily for the rest of the sector. And how we could enable funders to support it by identifying kind of communities, charities, funders, local authorities, etc., and philanthropists who are exploring similar questions to the questions that we have been asking over a number of years, and to kind of map some kind of map approaches and projects that are undertaking similar work so that we could identify what works really well, what doesn't work so well, and turn that into kind of practical tools to understand the complex issue of the funding ecosystem versus the ambition to create kind of systemic change in places. So we already knew that there was loads of really great work to build on, and we're really conscious of kind of the noise of the kind of systems change world. There's really brilliant work, but we also, and I personally feel really strongly about this, felt that actually quite a lot of that really brilliant work sometimes can be obscured in really difficult language, or it can be quite exclusionary in its approach. So we really wanted to intentionally create two different kind of distinct pieces that can help kind of shift focus of this kind of work a little bit. So firstly, ensuring that anything that we commissioned and anything that we produced was additive, crucially, and didn't kind of duplicate any existing really great material that's out there by the likes of Collaborate, Langkelly, National Lottery, Dark Matter Labs, etc., adding to that body of work. Secondly, being as crisp, clear, and accessible as possible was a really important leaning for us. Thirdly, ensuring it could be applicable across all different types of kind of thematic work, so not limited by thematic work at all, that anyone could dip into this inquiry and dip into the research or the framework of the tools that we developed and use it in their work, no matter what they were working on. It was really important to us. And crucially, that this work was shaped and framed by a range of different folks beyond ourselves. As I said at the top of the conversation, yes, it was important for us to explore these questions and get what we needed to get out of this inquiry, but it was critical that it had applicability beyond ourselves, and that was really important too. Hence the brilliant steering group kind of really shaping and driving the work itself. We wanted to add and be practical. We wanted to create space for long-term exchange and learning, and so that steering group was a really big part of that, as I mentioned. So we understood that funding is a crucial enabler of change for us, both in its ability to resource the activities that we wanted to do and create the change that we wanted to see in the particular places we were working with. But we understood, crucially, that we were not the only ones kind of tackling these questions. So in terms of our work and how it fit with our work at the time, as I mentioned, we are mobilising £8 to £11 million worth of resource into places every single year. And with that comes great responsibility as an organisation. So this was really important for us to recognise our role in the funding ecosystem as well as the overall ecosystem of civil society. So for us at Save the Children, we'd taken a bit of a turn over the last 10 years. We moved in the UK from pretty much a purely programmatic offering of kind of disparate, high quality, but disparate programs delivered all over the place in relation to lots of different themes, to a smaller set of kind of initiatives, a narrowed focus in terms of the kind of thematic area that we're focused on. So we are more focused now on the early years, early childhood, early learning, and the attainment gap than ever before. But also critically, we moved over that 10-year period away from programs into initiatives that are more intentionally systemic and place-based. And it's this journey that allowed us to kind of start to see where bits of our operating model were not allowing us to make that shift as quickly or as profoundly as we would like to. And the funding piece was the biggest piece of that kind of challenge. There's kind of a lag in our fundraising approach and in our kind of internal philosophy about money and our role, the role of money, how we behaved with funders and fundraisers behaved with funders as well, and how we perceive the role of money in the shape of our work and its ability to kind of drag us off course in terms of the kinds of change that we're seeking to make. I'm tackling that question for quite a while, but it became really, really stark when, as I say, we shifted towards having a kind of spectrum of place-based initiatives that we're trying to get off the ground and trying to embed. That spectrum consists of kind of three big initiatives. I guess on the far kind of right of that spectrum, there's the kind of pure community development initiatives like our Stronger Communities programme in Scotland. That is funded by just one funder, and that funder effectively owns that programme, and then we run it. So it's an interesting model and dynamic that we have up there. And in the middle, we have our Children's Communities project, which is an initiative that runs in 3 sites. 3 very different geographical sites across England. It's funded by 6 national and international trusts and foundations, all of whom have a slightly different philosophy and a slightly different kind of strategic approach to their funding. Some of whom are really bought in to the concept and others who are less so. And that's a really interesting dynamic we've experienced with 6 of them over time. And then finally, and this is where our thinking around funding really crystallized and became really, really important in relation to these initiatives, it was our newest initiative, our early learning communities, that really made us tackle this question. So this is a new area of work for us. We've been running it for about 3 years. It takes place in kind of 6 ward-sized places across England and Wales. At the moment, it is 50% funded by us, so our own unrestricted funding. So we are effectively a funder of that work in places, and also by private philanthropy and a range of different foundations. And that mixed model has created loads of tensions and difficulties, but also positives as well, in how that work has been progressing and maturing over time. It was our kind of experience of developing and running that program in particular, and all the other programs as well, and all those other projects as well, that gave us a real strong sense of kind of needing to tackle that issue, not for ourselves, but also for others. It made us think about the role of money. It made us think about funded practice. It made us think about fundraising approaches and the problematic ways of working on our side too. So I'll focus in on the Early Learning Communities initiative because it was the site of kind of most of our deep thinking on this. So that initiative itself is long-term. As I say, it's based in 6 places, and those places are ward-sized places, and it has a clear focus around the early years and the early learning in particular. It's multi-place, it's multi-partner, it's a collaborative approach, and it's defined by shared principles, not a specific model. So these are principles like, which will be common to all of you, I'm sure, principles like deep collaboration, being relational, mutualistic, long-term, etc., etc. We had to create a lot of the tools with others to help us develop this work from scratch. And we drew on a lot of the existing research that I've referenced before and that we referenced in the inquiry as well, and that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, to help us think through how we do this really, really well. We also created a fresh toolkit, an early learning toolkit, which is open source that everyone can access with data service design, to help us think about the approach itself and ensure we got the principles right, could work with communities in a way that's genuinely about power sharing and defining our kind of local strategies together. That all worked brilliantly, great, worked well. Big sticking point and the gap for us, as I said before, was having the practical tools and learning around funding and funding this stuff properly. So we ploughed on with our usual approach to fundraising for this work, which was effectively divorced from the intentionality behind the design of that work, and effectively undermined the first couple of years because there was no clear link between the guiding philosophies and the guiding parameters of the model, or of the principles that shaped the Early Learning Communities initiative and our fundraising approach. And those two things weren't necessarily speaking to each other in a helpful way. So we wanted to change our own approach, and we wanted to figure out exactly how to do that. And there was just a big gap in the market for us, a big gap in knowledge to help us do that. We were facing kind of big barriers, which again will be familiar to some of you, in kind of speaking to funders and generating funding. We were butting up against kind of poor understanding of complexity that was particularly pronounced with private philanthropists who are well-meaning, but similarly were driven by behaviours they'd seen from kind of large foundations, particularly corporate foundations, which kind of were focused on short funding cycle periods, wanting to see kind of measurable change over a really short period of time, using kind of proxies that were worse, kind of a distraction from the kind of change we're trying to achieve, and kind of having very unrealistic expectations of progress and a lack of mechanisms for kind of capturing or unlocking long-term capital for change was really, really challenging for us. So we were seeing that a lot, and the conversations we were having were quite circular as a result. Really difficult stuff. So we were caught in the funding sector's kind of reactive cycle of kind of funding programmatically and funding service in a service-driven kind of way, rather than generating funds that could help us deepen our relationships in those places and deepen the kind of our potential for creating the kind of systemic change we're trying to see over a period of time. So we wanted to uncover some of those tensions with a group of like-minded people, and as I say, create some tools to think about how we can make a difference and shift things. At the time, we didn't have the language to explain these challenges. We didn't have the language that the framework has now allowed us to kind of have, to identify where we were, identify those where we're trying to get to, and identify the kind of blockers that we were facing. That's been really valuable for us. We've since used the framework to, as I say, to kind of gauge where we are and where that particular initiative is in its level of maturity. So if you look at the framework itself as a really helpful way of thinking about this in the form of those step changes that John has just run us through, we had no idea where our work was on a helpful spectrum. And so this framework, again, really helped us think about that, and then helped us to have better conversations with funders that kind of that enabled us to have a conversation on a level playing field. where we could explain kind of the step change and the shift we're trying to make in our early learning, in each of those early learning communities, and therefore the kind of support that could be the most helpful for us at any given time. As I said, we didn't have the language for this before, and we didn't have the insight that the inquiry kind of allowed us to kind of get access to kind of have those kinds of conversations. But it's really helped us to think about this and really helped us to refine our own fundraising approach as a result of that, and really think about our business model as well. Plus also changing our own internal behaviors when it comes to fundraising and funding practice as well, which cannot be underestimated in terms of the potential impact of that in the future. Really, really important stuff, I think. The process of listening and understanding kind of different places kind of views on challenge of funding has been really, really valuable for us as an organisation. As John has already pointed to, it's been a really rich conversation over a number of months with a number of places and a number of funders, and it really helped us see kind of what barriers folks were facing and things that we didn't necessarily understand about the wider ecosystem have become really apparent to us. Again, that's really enabled us to kind of shift things forward in our work as well. Great. I've already said the framework itself gave us language we didn't have, and I think lots of people have said that, which is really encouraging, actually. I feel that that is a really golden thing that we have been able to provide for people, to give them the language to express where they need to go and what they need and what the challenges they are. And the diagnostic tool in particular, as well as the framework, is extremely helpful for us. It's something that we have now been starting to use with funders and talking about with funders. It's supporting them to make better, clearer choices about what and why they're funding us or others, and getting clear on the role that they should play or want to play in that particular initiative or in that particular place. As I've said before, it also sets the tone of the relationship between ourselves and that donor and that funder. And for me, this is a bit about kind of creating those boundaries and clarity early on in that relationship. And it's about kind of shifting power and creating space for emergent practice to happen in these places, enabled rather than hindered by funding, which for us is going to be really transformative. So it's been a big journey for us. It's been challenging. It's been challenging both internally, and as John is saying, kind of challenging the mental models that guide the way that we work as a national charity. That is a big shift. It's made folks think really differently about the role of funding in our international work as well as our domestic work. It's critically played a role in reshaping our thinking for our Early Learning Communities initiative and other place-based initiatives, as I've said. And thirdly, it's helping us to have productive conversations with funders that are supportive rather than, that are supportive and move us forward in kind of the relationships that we have and move us forward in this agenda. I'm really looking forward to a second phase of this, because this is just the beginning. This work isn't done at this point. And one of the critical things I think I'd love to see coming out of the second phase is a broader group of interested, like-minded people, organizations, places, etc., really sharing, learning in an open way, and testing things in kind of a live and open way as well, so that we can continue to build on the kind of practical, practice-focused way of kind of working in this way. I hope that makes some sense. And I hope that wasn't too rambly, and hopefully I'm on time. I'm sure Louise will tell me if I'm not. But that is it from my side of things. It's been a really important journey for us, and it isn't the end of that journey either. And I'm really looking forward to sharing what we're learning as we're going. So if anyone is interested in learning more about, say, the children's journey towards working in this way, or using the framework and the diagnostic tools, please do reach out to me after this conversation. I'd be happy to have a coffee and a chat virtually about how we're doing that.
Thank you so much, Natsayi. I really appreciate that, and hopefully that was of interest to all of you to sort of understand sort of the thinking and the uses of this work. Just before I hand over to Stephen, I just want to just remind you all, please do chuck in any questions onto the chat, either to me about the framework, to Natsayi, or when you're listening to Stephen, to him about his the practice that he's going to be talking about. We're going to have a good amount of time at the end to have a conversation, so please do put things in, and I'll come back to those. And just before I hand over to Stephen, I mentioned earlier just how important the visits that I did were to sort of help me understand and think about the different stages of this work and the 5 levels that I talked about. And it really was a conversation with Stephen and his colleague Paul that up in Ipswich, when I kind of on the train back, I really felt like it unlocked, just being in their building, and Stephen will talk about the building in a moment, and kind of hearing them talk about it and then talk about the sort of the way in which they thought about progress really kind of helped me unlock some of the amazing insights that I'd had from other people that I'd been to visit. And I just want to flag a couple of them. And I really, really couldn't stress enough that you should have a look at the case studies about them on our website. So yeah, there's Volunteering Matters that Stephen's going to talk about. There's Cora Foundation in Scotland, and some of the amazing work that they've been doing over a number of years in quite a lot of different communities across Scotland, and thinking about how a funder can stand next to and alongside communities. Southmead Development Trust in the Bristol area, a really, really interesting organisation which has a kind of community ownership of the building, and it's all about how that kind of the role of that asset is so crucial to what they're doing, and so how powerful it is in the community ownership and connection to that asset. And I really enjoyed going to see Amy and just learn about their work there. There's Ball Place, which is sort of a little bit different to some of the others, but a really, really interesting business model, and then trying to think about the connection that business and that building has to the land and to farming, and how they want to bring different people into that place and thinking about place in a slightly different way. I found that kind of often some insights most come from difference, and having Ball Place was a real kind of different lens on this for me, but the way in which they were thinking about place was illuminating. Onion Collective, another case study in Watchet, over in North Somerset, that really kind of genuinely inspiring group of individuals leading some change in their town, and they're just doing such a broad range of ambitious things that I just couldn't encourage you more to have a look at what they're up to and the ways in which they're thinking about what change means and what relationships look like across a community. Talking to, I've said that Louisa Mitchell is on our steering group, and just, the really impressive long-term example of West London Zone, a real kind of focused approach to supporting children and young people in an area, and really thinking about high quality interventions and support. So there's a little case study about them, but there's so much more you can find out about West London Zone on their site. And we didn't do a case study on the work of Right to Succeed, but they share some similarities with West London Zone as well. And I'd encourage anyone who's interested in children, young people and education to have a look at their practice. That definitely influenced me. And then there's also Centre 33 in Cambridge, do wonderful work with kind of volunteers and supporting young people. And I loved the conversation I had with them as they're thinking about, with Beth, thinking about the kind of how they shift their really long-term and successful and well-known and well kind of grounded in the community approach to more parts of their wider community. So they're very well known in Cambridge and Peterborough, and they're thinking about the role that place could take as they continue to develop and build on their very successful and long-term model. And then the final one that's on our site, there are many, many other examples across the country, is the work of Grapevine in Coventry. And they've kind of done a massive shift in recent years in their work. So I just wanted to flag all of those because I think, do read them, but mainly I want to introduce Stephen Skeet and thank him very much for all of his conversations with me, and I'm sure you're going to love listening to him.
No pressure. So hopefully you can see my screen now. Can you see that, John?
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, I'm Stephen from Volunteering Matters, and I've been, I guess, overseeing our work in Ipswich in the east of England for the last 5 years. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is about that work in the sense of that particular place. And I've got a series of sort of photos and content really for you just to look at, which will hopefully bring alive our work a little bit as we move through, and then you'll be able to think about that in the context of the framework. So if I start with this picture, actually this picture is probably in some respects the end. So Ipswich is a very old town and has really poor levels of social mobility. It's one of the 12 hotspot areas for Department of Education in England around lack of social mobility for young people. It's also a very diverse town, and there is much structural inequality that exists within the town. And really, our story of place is around how we've engaged marginalised and hidden groups of young people through social action, youth social action activities in the town, to build systemic change in kind of various settings and systems really within the town, by the power of young people finding out and understanding their own story, and using that story to hold a mirror up to different systems within the town. And that not only being an engine room for young people changing their lives as individuals, but actually starting to change the way that the town engages with young people. And why this is relevant is because this is Christchurch Mansion. It's a living museum. It has kind of national and internationally renowned art exhibitions and the like there. And every year they allow our young people to take over this space and build their own exhibitions based on the stories that they want to tell and the projects that they are delivering in the town across this year. And what that has ultimately led to in this context has been in April of next year, Marvel will be sending the Black Panther costumes and loaning them as an exhibition to Ipswich, to the town, for a year. And the town having an ambition of becoming a town of storytelling, where every young person in the town can see and feel and understand and tell their own story in the context of their lives. And that will be woven and embedded into the curriculum in the town. And that's really been driven by this 5-year process that we've undergone with our young people through our work in the town, that's kind of led the town into this position. So where do we start? Well, when you look at the approaches on the framework that John has highlighted, I think for us, we actually had a number of places that we were approaching this from. Firstly, we had a big building in the town. It was an old Crown Court, and we weren't really utilising it that effectively at the time. We've been under an organisational evolution in terms of rebranding and being much more centred around our understanding of place and social action in that place, and being led by our volunteers. And we, in Ipswich, at that time, we had a national charity programme, worked with supportive families, particularly families from different cultural heritages in the town, where we recruited and trained volunteer mentors to support those families who were at risk of significant harm, to be able to move forwards in their lives and access different services. And actually, it was from that national programme that this particular young person driven system change emanated. And what we found was there was a group of 30 young women who were in these families that were from 20 different nationalities, who were used to using the building. They saw it as a safe space. They trusted us as an organisation, but were consistently telling us in our support of them their stories and the issues that they faced as young people. And how they really didn't tell anyone or speak to anyone because they felt they had no voice or they had no agency, and there was no real system or pathway for them to support them. And myself and the team at the time, which were rooted in sort of youth justice and youth work practice, were really struck by the fact that we had a group of young people here who were kind of involved and beholden to structural inequalities, but had such a powerful set of stories and articulation and voice that we could, if we could unlock, actually we could help them change their own lives, but we could also actually look at how intersectionally we could kind of change different systems to improve the lives of other young people in their situations in the town. So that gave us a focus, and our focus was around, okay, how do we get this funded, and how do we really kind of think about moving forwards? And if you go back to where I started, which is the Black Panther exhibition and a town of storytelling for young people, there's no funder that's going to fund you when you walk into a room and say that's what we're hoping to achieve necessarily. So we had to think about how we frame this in a funding context. And essentially, hardly any funders would touch this group of young people or our work or kind of that belief. But we found through the local community foundation structure that the Police and Crime Commissioner would actually support this particular group of young people to go about setting up what they deemed at that point their own youth social action project. And so the project, which became known as WASUP, which is Women Against Sexual Exploitation Speak Up, was born. And we engaged a group of young people over the next 2 years, really to set about building a project in the town, which engaged young people that were in similar situations to the young people who were in our group at that time, and to think about how they could drive some sort of change through their project. And so they struck on the idea of creating a character, and that character was called Astra. Now, Astra is really important because Astra is still with us today, and she will be part of the Power of Stories exhibition with Black Panther. But she was created 5 years ago by this group of young people, and essentially Astra was made up of the composite parts of this group of young people's lives. And she enabled us to engage with the wider assets in the town, so particularly the cultural sector, such as theatres and the dance halls and the museums and photographers, to engage with this group of young people to help give them voice and to build Astra's story. And over the course of that first year, what they built effectively was a toolkit of Astra's story in an interactive sense that used spoken verse, imagery and film, and that could be delivered both to professionals and to children and young people in educational settings across the town. And they went to the heart of the system. They went to the safeguarding board, they had it observed, they got it endorsed by the safeguarding board, they got it written into Suffolk County Council child sexual exploitation policies and procedures for the county. So if I take you sort of very quickly 3 or 4 years on, actually the group matured in their approach. It grew because as they engaged with groups of young people in schools, young people started to engage with the issues that the young people were talking about in a completely different way or for the first time. And therefore the system of statutory services, i.e. social care, youth justice, etc., were finding they were having to adapt their approach to their work with young people based on the workshops that we were delivering in the town. Over the course of the next 3 years, the funder continued to back because they liked to see what it was that we were doing in the project. They believed it. We really reframed and turned our building over to those young people. So wherever those young people created this kind of imagery and this kind of content, that immediately went up on our walls. It was deemed to be important. That was all part of the agency process that we built in this group of young people. And then what we found was other services in the town wanted to come and reside in our building and work with us. So whether it was legal migrant help services, domestic abuse services, refugee support-based services, we ended up with about 25 different projects and services within the local town that came to our building, but that they slipped into the ethos that our building was being used and owned as a space by our young people through the work that they were doing. So over the course of that 3 years, they worked with about 6,000 young people. Now in Ipswich, every year 6 receive this toolkit delivered to them once a year. Those young people themselves now sit on the safeguarding board. The original group of young people are actually at university or have become youth social action ambassadors nationally. And they won a whole heap of national awards, and in 2018 were the third sector volunteer team of the year. But as a group, when you look at things becoming connected and then moving into that mutuality stage, what was really fascinating and interesting for us was as the groups of young people matured and as they worked with a different version of Astra and created their own versions of Astra, the intersectionality of the issues that they faced came out. So what was a single gender or group previously now actually started to engage with boys, started to look at issues around online safety and body shaming and body imagery, as well as gang grooming and county lines. I'm just going to play you a very short film because I think it will give you an idea of the
Are
quality.
you all right?
Okay.
Society tells her that body image doesn't count, but that's not what the media shouts. Comments flood her head. You're too tall, you're too small, you're too fat, you're too thin. All things she can't change, like the colour of her skin.
She's told not to listen to body image laws people lay. Be yourself, Astra, as all mates seem to say, whilst they're drawing over pics of Kim K. If only I could have a bum like that, hips like that, lips like that, but it's never gonna be like that.
No matter what she does, she'll always be this beautiful way. She must realize that not being society's perfect is perfectly okay.
As she walks down the street, she compares herself to other girls. She's so pale, her brow so fleeky. I love her hair, she can't help but stare. She glanced at her own reflection, critically analysed her complexion. Why can't she show herself the same affection that she gives so kindly to strangers passing by?
She raises others in her head so high, but they aren't any better than her really. She needs to start looking at life more clearly.
Looks don't mean much. We're all human beneath our outer exterior. It's really all about your interior. What makes you special to other living souls. Your achievement, your ambition, and your future goals.
More than body image, she's more than what you see. She must lock away the pointless negativity and throw away the key.
I am dynamic and daring.
I am courageous and creative.
I am sassy and unique.
I am loyal and passionate.
I am fantastic and fiery.
I am brave and bold.
I am powerful and free-spirited.
I am beautiful and confident.
I am caring and committed.
I am radical and resilient.
She is Astra, and we are all Astra in one way or another. That's why we come together to empower each other. Body image is for expressing the inner you. Don't waste it on conforming. Why cage a singing bird when it should be soaring?
I am Astra, as are you. Don't think you have to do what society tells you.
Okay, so hopefully that will give you a flavour of the kind of autonomy that we were giving to our young people and the level of kind of agency and voice that they had, and how that's them now taking ownership actually of the street and the spaces in and around our building, which was kind of that next progression after us giving them so much sort of ownership of the building and the way that we run it there in Ipswich. Just before I wrap up, what an interesting thing that happened, and I mentioned about no longer being single gender. So an interesting thing happened in the sense of when we were going and delivering this program to boys and telling Astra's story. Astra always had a younger sibling in her story called Patrick, and his story had never been developed. And boys were consistently saying to us, we want to develop his story. What about Patrick? What about his life in Ipswich? Where is his sense of place? And so we've worked with 100 boys across Ipswich to now build the brother project called We Are Patrick. And that is now also delivering in schools across Ipswich. And they've delivered their programs to 350 social workers and 200 police staff within the town as well. And finally, from me, this is there's an interesting thing around mutuality and how you move towards letting go of autonomy. And John brought this up in his talk earlier. But actually for us, this stage wasn't so much of a problem because it had been built in from the beginning. And therefore, when we got to the stage of needing to let go, actually in many ways, we never had the power. The power was always with that group of young people. And so that mutuality became much easier for us to deliver. And in part, the town itself kind of felt it had ownership of this group of young people. And therefore, we've not only seen the Christchurch Mansion takeovers, but we've seen the town hall and the university and the theatre in this context, which I'll just touch on in a second, all being taken over as well. and that the young people are now the mayoral programme of the year in Ipswich. So really becoming embedded into the fabric of the town. And the sort of endpoint really for this is February, because this was just before lockdown. So our group of young people worked with the local theatre for a year to put Astra and Patrick's life on the stage, and they performed it over 3 nights to national government, to MPs, and to local policy and decision makers and funders. And they came and saw in 4D on stage the lives of Astra and Patrick growing up in Ipswich, presented in front of them, and all the challenges therein. You know, I, as a leader in that space, I had no idea what they were creating at that time, actually, until the curtain went up, because they had total ownership and autonomy and trust in them to be able to do that. And what's really interesting, if you get the chance to read this, is the insert of the programme is the language that they are now using. And if you think back to the picture of Lanai at the beginning of, you know, you don't listen, so I don't speak, the language is now progressed over a 5-year period to Astra and Patrick are you and I, we're all Astra and Patrick are all of us. And the description of how they make change happens in terms of social action being a journey of self-exploration and restorative for them, helping them build a better relationship with themselves, but now building a better relationship with their community. I think that's a kind of a real nice point at which to end, in the sense of seeing how this group of young people have moved through the stages themselves, and then by consequence, we as an organisation have stood behind them, and ourselves have moved through those same stages with that group of young people. And I think that's it for me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen. I hope that was useful and interesting for you all to sort of just hear it made real rather than made conceptual, as the framework does. But I would really, and I think, you know, it's definitely worth exploring more about the work that the group of young people and the Voluntary Matters team have done in Ipswich. But I would also just, you know, repeat what I said before, to, you know, it's so that the kind of the detail of the work is so different to so many of the other case studies, that, you know, but what there are, so the similarities come in the values, in the approaches, and in the intention. And I think, you know, if you were to then look at what's going on in Southmead Development Trust, it would look very different to this in terms of the content, but actually the sort of the kinds of words that are used, the kinds of intentions, the kind of direction that they want to take, the kind of power that they want the community to take on. And in fact, in both of these examples, you know, as Stephen said, already had the power. It wasn't being given to them. You know, that's the similarities that we really wanted to get across with this framework. So I hope seeing that was helpful. And thank you so much, Stephen. So we've got a little bit of time for questions. So please do chuck any in to the chat if you have some. But there was one from Cheryl Garvey that I thought was interesting, asking about kind of the difference between place-based regeneration of the past and the sort of things that we're talking about here, and that's particularly pertinent to me because in a way that's the history of Renacii. We were established as an organisation that was designed, you know, that was going to deliver place-based regeneration programs, so big chunks of government money, and, you know, here's a place with a set of problems, invest this money in those places and try and fix them, you know, and all the things that we talk about much more in the social sector are kind of asset-based language rather than deficit-based language, about, you know, whatever your synonym for people in the lead or lived experiences, you know, a lot of that wasn't there at that time, but the intentions to improve places was. And I think what I found interesting as you kind of look back at the history of Renacii is kind of the history of kind of public policy of that time, of those 20 odd years, where we've kind of gone from this significant investment but with quite a deficit mindset through to a number of years of kind of focusing on individuals more than places, and how do we support a person into work, how do we think about tax credits, how do we think about things like that, then to sort of the austerity years where we've all had to think about, you know, the efficacy and impact of our own business models and kind of separated each other out, and how we kind of you know, how each organization works individually and each program works individually, and it's either good or bad on a sort of standards of evidence. I'm exaggerating a little there, but what I feel like I've seen in the last few years across the social sector, and led from very different organisations in different places, and but also most importantly from communities, is a demand for something a bit more systemic that kind of knits those things back into places, that says actually all of these things are connected. We do want to build on the brilliant things that individual organisations have done, but we do want to kind of knit them together locally. And I suppose that's what I see happening now, is that sort of next wave of policy interest almost, but it's still coming to life, and I think a lot of it is up for grabs about how we do it and whether it happens in the way that those of us who are working in the social sector think is going to achieve the most change and support the communities in the right way. So I think it's a great question, because it's something I think about quite a lot as to how this has changed. Just a question for you, Stephen, that has just popped up on the chat from Louisa from West London Zone. So if everyone wants to look at it rather than necessarily me reading it out, I just wonder if you want to have a swing at that, the systemic rather than programmatic.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Actually, it's something we talked about quite a bit, John.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting because actually, as this particular group of young people started to become really successful and kind of have a disproportionate impact, I guess, in terms of what they were delivering set against, the amount of money it was costing to fund it and the impact on their individual lives. The systems that they worked in and around from a funding perspective often only looked at what it was that those young people were talking about, and were trying to then fund them to be the next solution to their particular problem. So it's really interesting where our young people started to get platforms, national and local, around maybe mental health or criminal justice or inequality or online safety. And as a charity, we are none of those things. We're a social action charity, and we're only on those platforms because those young people have taken us onto those platforms. And so it was really interesting dilemma then when someone says, well, actually, can you come and do this here for, can you come and deliver that same program here for, whatever amount of money? And actually saying, we're not offering you that solution because that's a group of young people in that place who's created that particular thing, and that is where they're going and how we're standing behind them, because we think that's our core value as an organization, and we can use our privilege and our platform to be able to enable them to open up doors for them wherever they want to go, really. So in a funding context, what you're funding is that methodology and that approach to working with another group of young people or whoever in a place. But we absolutely, I couldn't tell you what it is it's going to look like in a year's time or 2 years' time, because actually that's not what you're funding. You're funding this approach and this methodology. And just as Natsayi said earlier, really, the difficulty for us was we didn't have this language then. So, most people sort of laughed us out of the room, really, in that sense, because everyone wants something programmatic ultimately, and that's really interesting. And we could do that for this. I could talk to you about, the social mobility of the young people that we've worked with, and those that are now at university, and those that are in the healthcare system, etc., those that now work for us, that are employed by us, for example. But we never really talk about that actually, because we just see that as an individual byproduct of what we're doing in a wider context, really. So it's brave. It takes a lot of good people in the same place to have the same values and be really true to that, and then reflect on what it is that they're doing. And I was very blessed that one of the lead people who have worked with this group of young people for 5 years was just an amazingly rooted in the local community and wouldn't let a lot of that stuff happen. So that was really great. And I guess the other thing I should say is as we got a couple of years in, we used to just ask the young people directly. So it became their decision after a while. Actually, we think, the youth offending team want you to go and deliver a gang grooming workshop over here. Is that something you're interested in? Is that what you want to do? Is that what you think is the right thing to do? does that fit in? If it is, then we can go, you can come with us and we can have conversations about how that's resourced. So we kind of built that process in as well.
Great, thank you. There's a couple more questions starting to come in. I'll just kind of highlight them and then to see if either of you want to kind of jump in on them. But Maxine's point about, if you've seen one community, you remember you've seen one, and I think that's really important. And I think some of the things that Stephen has just said really highlights that. But I suppose what we wanted to try and use with the framework is to acknowledge that whilst the communities are different, some of the systems are the same, and or share some similar features, I suppose, and therefore trying to think about ways to sort of not put too much of our language and presumptions on the places, but think about the kinds of work and approaches, as Stephen just described, that you might want to do. So to kind of very much let in Stephen's example, young people take the lead and not say what it's going to be, but the approaches of how people work feel so important. And that really kind of goes back to the initial definition that the steering group kind of set up around what place-based system change was. And I think, this question, building on in terms of, there's a couple of them now coming in around kind of what role of funders can be and what funders can do to ensure that the work remains as such rather than drifting. I think, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to this, Natsayi, just given some of your recent experiences, but for me, it's the dialogue between place and funder about values, because it's not easy to hold your course on these things.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And it sounds vague, but it's really important. It's about getting alongside in a really true sense, being patient, listening, taking the time to understand the principles behind the work that's being pitched to you. And lots of this will happen obviously outside formal funding rounds, which I think is a really important time and space to have these kinds of conversations and to try and have them really well. And then also actually using things like the diagnostic tool and the framework to ask those internal questions. Like, if we're actually trying to achieve, what is the role that we play in this place? And therefore, what are our intentions and what role might we want to play in relation to funding this particular initiative, this particular place? Really understanding that critically, and then shaping your relationship with your grantees, etc., accordingly. And also kind of checking that as you go. I think checking back that you're still kind of behaving in that way, that still is guiding all of the decisions that are being taken through the funding. If you've already funded a place, for example, checking back that are we still aligned with the original kind of principles that we engage with this place with front and center, with these principles front and center. Have we rolled back on that? Having those conversations with that place as well is really, really important. And being quite honest about whether or not as a funder you're ready to take the kind of leap that's required to work in this way. And it's totally fine if as a funder you're absolutely not ready to take that kind of leap. That is fine, but I think it's important to have honest internal conversations first, and then those honest conversations with your potential kind of grantees about what you're willing to do, what you're willing to relinquish, what you're willing to accept in terms of a level of vagueness or a lack of clarity that's inherent in this kind of work, and then kind of move from there. So honesty, conversation, dialogue, critical thought, like really engaging with all of that. It's much harder, much less crisp than funding a program that's A, B, C, but it's necessary.
Yeah, and I'd really endorse that from the kind of the conversations that we had with all the different funders about just understanding, sometimes it's very easy if you're a charity or a social enterprise or a community to sort of say, oh, funders should do this, but actually engaging with funders about why they do what they do and the parameters for their work and the things that influence their decision making, I think was so important to help us understand what might be useful in these relationships.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's a really great question from Richard Graham about evaluating and learning, and I'd be interested to see if Stephen and Natsayi want to chip in on this. But at Natsayi, our consultancy team do quite a bit of evaluation of place-based programs. So we're working with a range of other colleague organisations on evaluation of the place-based social action programme, which is DCMS and National Lottery Community Fund funded, and there's some really great learning reports on the National Lottery Community Fund's website about that programme. So there's some things in there that we also work with Power to Change on the Empowering Places programme. So, and I'm just put into the chat a link to, it's an example of a framework and toolkit from Australia that we have kind of tried to use, and we've been influenced by in a lot of our practice. And I think that some of the tools within that toolkit might be of use and of interest to you know, it's done from an Australian context, but there's lots of things which are applicable. And so, you know, if you are interested, Richard, in talking more, than a couple of my colleagues, you know, would be only too happy to talk to you. But there's lots of others out there who do this, and I really like the Australian work I've put there. But I don't know if, Stephen, is there anything you want to say about evaluation and or learning as well?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really interesting because I actually see that very much as kind of phase 2, really. And you know, I would love to see kind of the community of practice kind of drive some of that agenda, really, in terms of what the evaluation looks like. I mean, you know, in some respects, you're always driven by the you know, the necessity of what you've built with your funder and what your agreement is. The thing that we've really struck on for us in particular is storytelling, and I sort of referred to it at the beginning, really. But because so much of the system change that we're trying to drive is looking at the intersectionality of issues, you know, whether that's around socioeconomics or gender or race, you know, structural inequalities, really. You know, programs do not really help that. They might help you address an individual's inequality and move them from A to B, but they don't actually help you to address structures. And so the only way we've really been able to do that is to tell stories. And that's where Astra and Patrick have been great in that sense, because suddenly people cannot refute that as evidence that those two young people exist, because they've been created by young people themselves based on their stories. So that's as far as we've got, but I would love to see the framework kind of morph into some form of kind of you know, evaluation sort of framework and toolkit without being too prescriptive. I mean, this is always the challenge, and you know, not driving the organic nature out of you know, what the tasks are around being place-based. But you know, I would love to see a community of practice take that head on, really.
Great, thanks. And Natsayi, anything for you? Just I'm conscious of time, so
sure.
last one to answer.
Totally would just back what Stephen has just said. It's a challenging space, and I think a really important question for the kind of future phases to kind of try and address. And I know it hasn't been cracked by anyone. I think there's a kind of we've taken a kind of a mixed approach. I haven't got time to explain all of that right now, but if anyone wants to know a bit more, please do reach out to me. And as Stephen is saying, one of the key components of that is around storytelling and capturing the intangible through those stories, because that is where the kind of the ambition to kind of hardwire change into the system is really, you can't crisply, like, you know, evaluate that or prove that you're moving towards that in kind of in a traditional sense. Your storytelling is a really important part of us being able to kind of evidence that shift and evidence those shifts over time. So we're working on kind of building that into our own evaluation practice as well. Like I say, no one has fully cracked it just yet. So if you want to have a conversation, my door is open. Great,
thank you. And thank you everybody for your questions. Really great questions, actually, and really kind of get to the heart of some of the, you know, the strengths, but also the challenges of this sort of work. So we just have a few minutes to go. So I just want to wrap up. So firstly, I just want to say in terms of what's next. There's a couple of things, and we'll put this in the link to in the kind of what we send around to everybody afterwards. But you know, as I said at the start, we have a community practice idea that we're starting to kind of set up, early days of it, and we're kind of keen to be influenced by others around what that starts to look like. So we would, if you're interested in that, we'll send around the link to that. Particularly if you're a place or an organisation thinking about some of these questions that have been highlighted here. On the funder side, I'm talking to the Association of Charitable Foundations place-based funding group next week. So if you're a member of ACF and want to go to that group, then I'm going to be sort of taking some of the content from this, but also pushing it much more towards kind of what could funders do next and how could they maybe use some of these tools. But if you're not involved in that and would like to get in touch, please do with either myself or Natsayi as well to talk about her experiences too. We are interested in kind of disseminating the kind of the ideas here. And then the final thing I'd say is what next is that kind of point about evaluation and learning. There's a number of partners that are talking about the kind of the challenges of learning across these sorts of questions. And, I think the question of learning, I think, could be a really important part of whatever phase 2 that Natsayi has talked about for this could be. So, there's a number of ways in which that could go, but I've just seen a comment on the thread on the chat from Mike. I had a conversation yesterday with colleagues at Local Trust about some of the ways in which they're thinking about learning and their relationship between community and systems in this place-based approaches. And I think there's so much amazing work happening around the country, but what I was so struck by when I went to visit everybody was a lack of confidence around some of the terminology. So people didn't want to own, no, we're not doing system change. It felt like too big and scary a term almost. It was like, well, we're doing this, but actually I'd love to speak to somebody who knows how to do that better, or I'd love to know what good looks like here, because I feel like we've just been, iterating for the last few years, and actually the people that have been iterating and applying the values that we've been talking about have been doing some of the most inspiring and interesting work. And for me, that's the really big part of the next step, is how do we kind of use some of the language that we've started to and the framework that we've built here to sort of allow more of that practice to come together and learn from each other, because there's so much good stuff going on, and start to mutually answer some of the questions that you've been raising around things like, well, how do we evaluate this sort of stuff well? How do we hold the line with funders? How do we build mutually supportive relationships? Please look out for the follow-up email with kind of links and things in. Please do have a look at all of the reports. Please do get in touch with any of us if you would like to know more. We'd love to keep talking. And as we've said a few times, this is the sort of the start of this work in many ways, rather than at the end. We want to build on this. So I just want to give a massive thank you to Natsayi and Stephen for giving your time and talking today and sharing your insights and experiences. I think it's really, really valuable. And thank you to all of you for attending. It's great to have such a lot of interest in this, and we'll be sharing the video with quite a lot of other people who couldn't make it but really wanted to come. So thank you all for your time. And with 30 seconds to go, we are done. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.